Hello, Facebook world. I think we have me logged in from my phone, and we should be live. If anybody is there, would you let me know? I'm so sorry we're having technical difficulties. I'm at home working on my home laptop, and I think maybe we had some of the settings weren't quite right for what we were trying to start at 10:30 today. So I think it's working. It looks like we've got a few people watching. And Hannah, if you would just text me to let me know that you can hear and see me okay. And Hannah, assuming you all can hear me okay, if you can give me a thumbs up or something, that would be great. I will get started. And I apologize for the late start today. Again, we're having some technical issues. Hannah, can you hear me okay? I saw that you could see me. Just making sure before we... on the camera. Yes, perfect. All right. Very good. Well, welcome. Thank you all for tuning in. Whether this is the live stream, we're now about 10:50 on Thursday morning, February the 18th. I again apologize with the technical issues. But it's so great. We have some people joining us live, and then those of you who might watch this video as part of our My Story series, welcome. Thank you for tuning in, however you are. I hope that this video and this feed finds you warm and safe. Thank you all for your comments. I appreciate that you can hear and see me. Wish I could hear and see you as well. We can interact a little bit through the chat, and that'll be great. If you have questions as we go through, you can post them on this page, or you can send Hannah, our administrative assistant for adult formation, an email. And if I don't get to something today, I'm happy to address it in the coming weeks. So this is going to be a really, really interesting, fun time together. And I'm going to do my best to get through the whole lesson I had prepared for us today. So again, I'm Eric Liles. I'm the associate for formation at St. Michael and All Angels. I've been there almost 4 years now. I am really excited to present this class called Second Temple Judaism, or the Judaisms of Jesus. And I'm excited about it because this is a subject I became passionate about actually after seminary, when I started parish ministry and started reading the Bible more and more and preaching more and more and thinking about how we understand Jesus and how Jesus understood himself. And I had a great privilege when working on my doctorate of ministry to take a class along these lines. And it was very informative to me. Some of the things that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks are not in our Bible. And I'll talk more about them week by week and kind of what we're going to be looking at. But they definitely inform Jesus in his life and ministry. And I'll talk about how and why I think that is as well. I started studying the Bible seriously in high school, and the book of Revelation was the first one I read all the way through. That is not a good place to start. Revelation maybe is a good place to end. There are a couple books of the Bible, I think some Jewish elders say, like, you shouldn't read the book of Ezekiel until you're 40 years old and have been studying Torah for 40 years. And so Revelation, Daniel, which we're going to talk about today, Ezekiel, these books are very complicated, and it helps us to have a good background. So I'll do my best to get those to you. I'm going to start with a prayer, and then I'm going to dive into the course outline. This prayer, the first part of it, comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. Let's pray. Ah, Lord, great and awesome God, keeping covenant and steadfast love with those who love you and keep your commandments. We have sinned and done wrong, acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. Help us to heed your words to us, to repent of our sin, and to abide in your mercy, grace, and love. Amen. I thought that was a good prayer from some of the chapters we're going to be looking at today. Primarily, and it'll take us a little while to get there, we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12. And they are really the only apocalyptic official literature that happens in the Hebrew Bible. or the Protestant Bible as it exists. So just a quick walkthrough of what we're going to be up to the next few weeks. Today, we're going to talk about the Hebrew Bible after the exile, and there's some important dates that are out there. We sent out an email earlier this week that have those important dates. If you don't have that, I'll walk through them, but please let Hannah know to add you to the email list, and she can send you the important dates and the course outline and those kinds of things. So today, we're going to talk mostly about Daniel. We won't have too much time to talk about some of the other literature, but I'll certainly mention them. And then next Thursday, we're going to talk about the Jewish pseudepigrapha. It's a big word. It's a $5 seminary word. And the Jewish pseudepigrapha are works that are written between about 300 before the Common Era to 300 in the Common Era. So this is the year 2021 of the Common Era. We use BCE and CE to distinguish between BC and AD, just because Jesus was probably born around the year 4 BC, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So we use Common Era and before the Common Era. So next week, when we talk about the Jewish pseudepigrapha, we're primarily going to be looking at a book called First Enoch, which happens to be in some Bibles, some Christian Bibles, the Ethiopian Bible especially, and we'll look at maybe the Book of Jubilees and 3rd and 4th Maccabees, where Hanukkah comes from, those kinds of things. And then the week after that, we're going to look at the Apocrypha, which is part of our Episcopal Bible. You can read about it in the historic documents, kind of where it comes from. But mostly these are books that are Jewish canon that were not written in Hebrew, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So we'll look at a couple of things from the Apocrypha. We'll have a week off for spring break. We'll come back. We'll do a deep dive into the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1 week. Wish I had more time with you there. And then we'll wrap up on Thursday, March 25th, looking at the New Testament and the different Judaisms that are presented in there. And there are several. So that's the general course outline. And now I want to focus on some important dates. I think anytime we're studying the Bible, it's important to know sort of contextually where we are in history, whether that be where the story is taking place or whether that be when things were codified, written down, sort of put into final form and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to walk through these really quickly. Again, I hope you have a copy of them. And I'll talk about them kind of a little bit today as we go through some of these things. So the first event I want to mention is the Exodus, right? That very important event where the Hebrew people are living in slavery generations after Joseph has been in charge of Pharaoh's things, and now they're kind of enslaved in Egypt, and Moses comes along and God frees them. They leave through the Red Sea and have the wilderness journey. So the Exodus event is super significant in the life of Judaism, all forms of Judaism, and for Christianity as well. And it happens around the 13th century BCE. So that's 3,300 years ago, when we're somewhere around there, okay? And then it takes a while, of course, 40 years of wandering, which 40 years means a good amount of time as we read Hebrew Bible, until the people settle into the promised land in Canaan. And after they've settled, it takes a while for them to become established as a nation. And eventually, there will be one united kingdom of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's going to be first united under King Saul, and then King David, and then King Solomon, and then it all falls apart. But that united kingdom that happens under Saul and David and Solomon is from around 1021 to 931 BCE, so the 11th century, more or less. After Israel is united, they are going to split into a northern and southern kingdom. We read about these in our prophets like Hosea and Amos and others in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and in Chronicles, where different prophets are speaking to different people in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. A group of people called the Assyrians come along, and they kind of wipe out the northern kingdom. There's prophecies against the northern kingdom before that happens. And that really super important date, the fall of the northern kingdom, is 722 BCE. So from the north, there are refugees then that come down into the southern kingdom of Israel, of Judah. And In the southern kingdom, they're going to be united. And if we are reading through the prophets like Jeremiah and the first part of Isaiah, there's a lot of warnings, change your ways, or even Jerusalem is going to fall, and they don't believe it. But eventually, when the Babylonians come along and kind of take over empire from the Assyrians, in fact, the southern kingdom and Jerusalem does fall, and the temple is destroyed. And the fall of the southern kingdom, this is the second sort of really important date. I'm just going to say 585 BCE. So you have 722, the northern kingdom falls, 585 BCE. So the Babylonians take some of the Hebrew people, the Israelites, into exile, and we hear about that through the book of Ezekiel, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and some other writings. Second Isaiah is another one. So about a 50-year period of time. I think God had promised 70, but somehow it got cut shorter before they're invited to return home after the Persians conquer the Babylonians. So we've got these big groups: Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and then we'll go to Greeks, Ptolemy, the Seleucids, eventually the Romans. And what we're going to see in this Second Temple period, which begins about 538 and goes through when the temple is destroyed in the year 70, the same temple that Jesus was at. The temple's not finished in construction immediately when the people return. In fact, it's a very long and kind of complicated story. But the beginning of the construction we read about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah as the people return from exile back into Jerusalem. So this course is primarily dealing with Second Temple Judaism. But there's a few things I want to mention that I think are important. One of them is the difference between when books are written and when they are created. So there's a long oral tradition in Hebrew Bible that goes all the way back, to creation, to the calling of Abraham. Those stories were passed down for generations to generations. Some of them were written down. Parts of the Bible were certainly written down before the exile. In fact, parts of Deuteronomy were found in the temple treasury during the reign of King Josiah. So after we have Saul, and then he's not really a great king, David, great king, Solomon, pretty good, has some indiscretions, as does David. After that, when the kingdom kind of gets divided, we have a bunch of wicked and awful kings. There's two exceptions, and one of them is King Josiah. And around 622 BCE, so the northern kingdom fell 100 years ago, so maybe part of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, were written in the northern kingdom and came down to the southern kingdom. But in any case, part of Deuteronomy was found, and the king begins to have some reforms. So we know part of Hebrew Bible was certainly written down before the exile, but much of it was codified after. And the reason we know that is the Persians, unlike the Babylonians or the Assyrians, wanted the people they were ruling to have their own holy texts. So they said, basically, send us a copy. How are you worshiping? Who are you worshiping? Why are you worshiping, and how? Send us a copy. So, of course, Torah is written down and sent up there, and other books begin to be written down. During the exile itself, we know that Ezekiel is the first prophet who actually writes his prophecy down. He mentions listen to me, Ezekiel, write this down. And so that's happening. There were things written before, again, but that gives us a sense. So we're talking about this post-exile period, and the post-exile period is going to start being under the Persians, and then eventually the Greeks and some other groups, and then eventually the Romans, where we find Jesus in our stories from the Gospels and in the New Testament. So what is Second Temple Judaism overall, and why does it matter? Why should we care about this? So if you think about pre-temple times, way back, think of Moses, think of the Exodus. God promises that there will be a prophet like Moses in every generation, right? And then as the people begin to settle into the promised land, they start to ask for a king. And God has appointed judges. And there's a prophet like Moses. We go from Moses to Joshua there's several other prophets that happen. And then, of course, later we'll have Nathan and Samuel and Elijah and Elisha. These are the sort of promised prophets in every generation. So we have this period of the judges, and the people are clamoring for a king. And God is very clear, and he's speaking through the judges and through the prophets. You don't want a king. If you get a king, they're just going to mess everything up. I, Yahweh, God, am your king. People are like, no, we want a king. So eventually the Lord relents, and Samuel is sent to anoint Saul as the first king of Israel. And once we have a king in place, we go from having a prophet every generation to, after David, God makes a promise that there will be a king on the throne in David's lineage forever. And so that's a very interesting promise about the kingdom of Israel and a king or ruler overseeing the people on God's behalf. And finally then, the exile happens, again, 585. Now we don't have our temple. We don't have a king anymore. The king's been carried off to exile. The prophets are still speaking, but we're trying to figure out, what does all this mean after exile? Has God abandoned us? Do we still have this covenant relationship with God? Who are we to be? And so in Second Temple Judaism, we're going to look a lot at some apocalyptic literature. And the difference between prophets and apocalyptic literature are important. So first of all, what prophets do in the Hebrew Bible is they call the people to repentance. There's a threat. Judgment is what happens within history. So if you don't turn away from worshiping false gods, Jerusalem will be destroyed, says Jeremiah, and then it is, right? A prophetic oracle is when the word of the Lord comes to someone. There's an oral or a verbal communication. Has one or two components at least. Oftentimes, these are written down by the people who are hearing them. Jeremiah has a scribe whose name is Baruch, things like that. The apocalyptic view is different. There's a heaven, a place, a then, and then there's a now. And what happens when these revelations take place, apocalypse visions take place, and we see this in Revelation 4, and we'll look at this the last days, is someone gets caught up into heaven. I think Ezekiel is picked up by his hair several times, but John of Patmos is taken up into heaven, and there is given a vision of what is or will be going on down here. The vision transcends time, the end of the age, the final judgment, the resurrection. And these apocalyptic utterances become ripe with big theological questions and ideas, and they become the basis for our theological questions within Christianity. You see, when the Greeks show up, Alexander the Great, 325 BCE, all of a sudden the problems within Judaism get really big. And so the questions get really big also. And it takes a couple of these empires before all these questions are raised. And so the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, are asking, look, we had David and we had Solomon, and then it all fell apart, and now everyone is beating us up. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, et cetera, and on and on. This present age that we're living in, it's evil. And so if it's going to be fixed, there needs to be some cosmic cause. It can't come from us. It's got to come from God. It's got to come from heaven, from the divine realm. And because of the influence of Persians, who many were Zoroastrianism, they're going to help introduce concepts like dualism. And they're going to help Jewish people develop their concept of angels. And then later on, through this dualism and angels and heaven and hell, and as all of these concepts get developed during this Second Temple period of time, in Revelation, we'll see that a Roman leader can be called being possessed by Satan. Nero, Caesar, we'll look at that on the last time as well. So there becomes this genre of book called Apocalypse, and it's a story about an ascent. A seer gets caught up, gets a tour of heaven. The the book of Revelation has 4 of these. I was in the Spirit. There's an idea that it's all part of creation, comes from Genesis, that's still present in creation. You're taken up through the dome of the sky. On the other side, there's clouds, winds, thunder. All of that proceeds the throne of God, the throne of grace. And so an apocalypse is an author writing down a narrative about a visionary experience which always comes at the invitation of a heavenly being. Apocalypticism, the type of writing, is a political type of writing. Mysticism is sort of more of a personalized vision, but at this point they're kind of one and the same. Usually there's some sort of interpreting angel, and we'll look at that a little bit today as well. In the apocalyptic writing, one of the things that's kind of important to note is the prophets will write with the authority of their own name, right? So Ezekiel is writing Ezekiel. Isaiah is writing first Isaiah, later prototypical parts of, proto-apocalyptic parts of Isaiah, they're going to use Isaiah's name. And the same with Daniel. Daniel is a figure that's named a couple of different places in the Bible. And so when we look at apocalyptic literature, it might be titled someone's name, and they're using the authority of that name from history. The Greeks did this a ton with their writing as well, and that's just one of the things I think is important to remember. Somewhere along the line in the Second Temple Judaism, and we're going to get there, this concept of Messiah comes in. This concept of Messiah doesn't exist in First Temple Judaism. It is a Second Temple Judaism concept. The Messiah is going to come sometime before judgment or rapture or sometime right after. And so there's this apocalyptic view. There's a heaven, there's a now, there's this future that's going to happen. All right, real quickly, there's 4 parts of the Hebrew Bible that are, or 5, that are sort of proto-apocalyptic. And I just read you a couple of lines from Ezekiel 38. I'm going to start in verse 22. Just listen to the type of language that's used. Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 22 says this: I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and on the many nations with him. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness. I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. So this is Ezekiel having a vision. This is the word that's coming against the world, specifically against Gog, that God is going to come and act. So you can see how this is not quite fully apocalyptic, but it's a pretense for this type of literature. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 through 5 is another. I'll read just a few verses of this. See, a day is coming for the Lord when the plunder taken from you will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken and the houses looted. Bad stuff happens. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in 2 from east to west by a very wide valley, so that half the mount shall withdraw northwards and the other southwards, and you shall flee by the valley to the Lord's mountain. So these are proto-apocalyptic parts of the Hebrew Bible, thinking about, okay, we're struggling with these foreign powers, these oppressors. We're hoping for a future that God has to realize for us. And so how is that going to happen? Now, as we get into Daniel today, I want to make a special note that the Rector's Bible Study, Chris Garotta's done a great job of going chapter by chapter through the book of Daniel in much greater detail than I'll have time to today. It's an excellent study. If you want to watch those videos, you can find them on our website, stmichael.org, and then Rector's Bible Study. So I commend that to you if you're interested in going and doing sort of a detailed study, if you haven't already, through the book of Daniel. But the book of Daniel itself is composed early in the 2nd century. And if you go back to that important list of dates, I didn't finish it. I kind of stopped at the exile. The fall of the Persians to the Greeks, about 325, somewhere in there. And then there's a Maccabean revolt in 168, and that is kind of what we're going to talk about today. We'll skip the rest of those dates for now. So 168 is an important date to keep in mind as we begin to look at the book of Daniel. So the first half of the book of Daniel is set in the period of the exile. So I said 585. The exile starts before that. 585 is about the year when Jerusalem's destroyed. So those 50 years or so, when the people are in exile, that's when the book of Daniel, the first half of it, takes place. And we hear about kings and what's happening. One of the interesting things about the composition of the book of Daniel is that it's actually written in multiple languages. So we have parts of it that are in Hebrew, parts that are in Aramaic, and then parts that are in Greek. And that complicates things a little bit. In our Apocrypha, you might note it that there are the Greek sections of Daniel that are included in there. So think of Bel and the Dragon, or Susanna, or the Tales of the Three Young Men, or the Prayer of the Three Young Men. And so 168 is important because the first half, again, is taking place in the first 50 years of exile, 585, those 50 years. But what's referenced in Daniel 7 through 12 are the events that are happening with the Maccabean revolt and their particular reason while that is happening. I'm going to skip a lot of my notes, and I'm going to dive into the Apocalyptic Visions, Daniel 7 through 12. Okay, again, eschatological theme, the end times. The present age is evil. All good has been subverted. Evil seems to be winning everywhere. The righteous are oppressed. They need encouragement. So there's a great tribulation. Persecution is happening. Turbulence, warfare has to precede the end of days. So some of the changes that have occurred within Judaism during the Persian and then the Greek or Hellenistic periods are concepts of angels, dualism, meaning there's a cosmic war between good and evil, or light and dark maybe, but there's that doesn't exist in First Temple Judaism. You've got God, and then you've got false gods, right? That they don't measure up and that kind of thing. But we begin to get this more cosmic, dualistic understanding that is influenced by the Persians and Zoroastrianism. And we start for the first time to really get a concept of resurrection. If you look at Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, this is kind of one of the first references to this. And it says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So that definitely is a concept of resurrection. It's different than the concept we find in Ezekiel of the valley of the dry bones, or Job, surely in those days, with my own eyes I'll see my maker. Those are concepts of resuscitation, which are a little different than the concept of resurrection, which is entering into Judaism really pretty late, so after some of these things have happened. So it's just a quick summary of Daniel 7 through 12. There's a conflict between heaven and earth. The angel armies of Yahweh of God and Persia are battling each other. Eventually, there's a downfall of the oppressors and the emergence of Yahweh as God supreme. Chris did a great job of walking through chapter 7 with the four beasts and how they represent different empires. The Babylonians or Chaldeans, Medes, Persians, Seleucids, Greeks, Romans. All of these things are kind of in play. All right. So what I want to do is I want to turn to chapter 7, and I want to read a couple of verses. I'm going to start in verse 9, and then I want to talk about how this relates in real time to what's going on in those years about 168 BCE. All right, so chapter 7, starting in verse 9. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So this is Daniel caught up into heaven, having a vision of an ancient one, God the Father, a description of him, which looks very similar to the description in Revelation that we'll get. And this is a time of judgment. So this is a future time, eschatological, end of the things time, and the books of judgment are open. And we'll hear more about those books in the book of Revelation with the bowls and all the things. And then continuing in verse 13. As I watched in the night visions, I saw someone like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him, and to him were given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Now, as Christians, we're going to read that and we're going to say, well, that's Jesus. One like a human being, one like a son of man. But reading this as the Hebrew people would have read Daniel, they really think of an angel. They're thinking of a specific angel named Michael, which we at St. Michael's know a little bit about. And he has a particular role in helping to lead the people into their glorious future. Next week, when we talk about Enoch, I don't know that we're going to read the parables of Enoch. We're probably going to focus mostly on the 3 apocalypses that happen in 1st Enoch. But that son of man, we have one like a human being, son of man. In Enoch, it's that son of man. And then the Gospels will become the son of man. So you can see that Jesus has an understanding of himself as one like a human being, as like that son of man from 1st Enoch. And he will then call himself and be called by others as the Son of Man. Flip over to Daniel chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. And this is where I really want to talk about the historical context of 168, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. Daniel chapter 8, starting in verse 14. And he answered him, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice by the Uli calling, Gabriel, help this man understand this vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end. So there's several things going on here which are really important. One, we need to understand that the Second Temple has been defiled. And this happens through a particular person, Antiochus, around the year 168 BCE. I think he goes and sacrifices some pigs on the altar. My memory of that story is not the best right now. But what you need to know is, if you understand how the temple is to be used and the sacrifices and the purity of it and the holiness that emanates from it and all those kinds of things, obviously you can't have a Greek Seleucid leader come in and sacrifice pigs on the altar. That is desecrate. That's called the desecrating sacrilege. You may have heard that before. And so what happens within Judaism, there are some, we don't have kings anymore. We have priests who oversee the temple, and some of them are corrupted. There is a particular lineage, Zadokite, which Zadok was a descendant of Aaron, of course, who is part of the Levites. We go all the way back to the 12 tribes. But the Zadokites really had control, and when the temple itself is desecrated, some of the priestly class leave, and they will go find a community like in Qumran, and we'll talk about them with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they've had enough of, we thought Jerusalem was the place, but we've been in exile, and since we've been back, things haven't been great. We've had all these foreign oppressors. Now the temple's been desecrated. We need to go figure out how to live pure lives in relationship with our God, and so they leave. Within Jerusalem, we'll hear about the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees, and Judas Maccabee and his great revolt, and how that effort to recapture the temple kind of goes. So when we look at some of these verses here, specifically, we're looking at those things. So that was verse 14. The sanctuary is going to be restored. And then Daniel's having this vision, and he's trying to understand it. And who comes to help him? None other than the angel Gabriel. Now, we know about Gabriel because Gabriel is an important figure in our New Testament. But Gabriel here is an important figure because he comes to interpret the vision. And as we should all do when we encounter an angel, when Daniel encounters Gabriel, he falls on his face in fear. Angels are awe-filled and wonderful and frightening, kind of, in those ways. I think that's all I want to say about that for now. In chapter 9, real quick, verses 20 to 22, we're going to see a couple things here. So let me read these. While I was speaking, I'm in Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. While I was speaking and was praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, good prophets do that, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God on behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen before in a vision, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. He came and said to me, Daniel, I have now come out to give you wisdom and understanding. So Gabriel here is again appearing sort of as an angel, but he's called the man Gabriel. And I think that's important when we read through Daniel and we see one like a son of man or one who had the appearance of a man. We're really talking about angels. And all this is going on. Daniel is talking about what's going to happen in the context of the temple being desecrated and these end times that are coming. All right, so moving on to Daniel chapter 10. I apologize for rushing through this. We got a late start with our technical difficulties, but again, appreciate you tuning in either now in the live stream or through the video later. Daniel chapter 10, starting in verse 5, Daniel is speaking and he says this. I looked up and saw a man clothed in linen with a belt of gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the roar of a multitude. I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. The people who were with me did not see the vision, though a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled and hid themselves. Beginning of this chapter, Daniel is talking about how he's been in mourning. He's been in mourning for what's going to happen. Remember, he's having this vision in the context of early on in the exile, but the events that he's seeing are happening kind of in real time as these are being written down, the desolation of the temple in Jerusalem. And so he's mourning. He hasn't eaten anything in 3 weeks. He hasn't anointed himself. He's not bathing. He comes outside and has this incredible vision of this man clothed in linen. We should hear that as, we want to hear that as Jesus, but we should hear that as some angelic figure, right? But the description does parallel, when we get to the book of Revelation, some of how the Son of God is portrayed in his description as well. All right, now down to verse 10. But then a hand touched me and roused me to my hands and knees, and he said to me, Daniel, greatly beloved, pay attention to the words that I'm going to speak to you. Stand on your feet, for I have now been sent to you. Again, this person is talking to him. So while he was speaking the words to me, I stood up trembling. He said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for it is from the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and humble yourself before your God. Your words have been heard, but I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. So Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. And I left him there with the prince of the kingdom of Persia, and have come to you to help you understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days, for there is a further vision from those days. And then while he was speaking to me, I turned my face towards the ground. I was speechless, and then one in human form came and touched my lips. So a couple things really cool that are happening here in this little bit. One, like a son of man, like a human, is speaking to Daniel. And again, for us, maybe that is the Christ figure. But he's also talking about he was delayed because there's this battle, right? There's this cosmic battle that's happening at the end of time between the prince of Persia and Michael, one of our chief princes, Michael, the archangel. So there's this cosmic battle that's happening. This person leaves to come and explain to Daniel what's happening, what's going to happen at the end time, and help interpret him. And Daniel has the person touch his lips. That's not the first time that a prophet's had that sort of authority bestowed upon him, right? I think it's the beginning of Isaiah, that I'm a man of unclean people, and the seraphs, the angels, take a burning coal and touch his mouth, and other prophets, there'll always be this moment of demur. I'm not old enough or wise enough, or I don't know how to speak or whatever, and God's angels usually are there to help the prophets get these things right. So Michael is going to come. One more little section here in chapter 10, verses 18 through 21. So he touches his lips and he says, verse 20, "Do you know why I've come to you? Now I must return and fight against the prince of Persia. And when I'm through with him, the prince of Greece will come. But I am to tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is no one with me who contends against these princes except Michael, your prince." Michael, the prince. The book of Ezekiel ends with a vision of a new Jerusalem out of exile. That is not the Jerusalem and the temple that is built by Ezra and Nehemiah and through on the generations. God's vision of the new Jerusalem through the book of Ezekiel doesn't have a king, but has a prince. And so these themes are picked up here in Daniel. And that prince that comes and is going to help rule God's people is Michael, the archangel. During this period of Second Temple Judaism, the concept of Messiah is going to start to get developed. But we've got some time to go before we get there. Let me read one more section from Daniel chapter 12. And we begin to ask questions about how do we deal with suffering? What is resurrection? What does that look like? Those kinds of things. And so from the last chapter of the Hebrew version of the book of Daniel, starting at the first verse, on the end times. "At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who were asleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, keep the word secret and the book sealed until that time of the end. Many shall come running back and forth, and evil shall increase." Verse 5, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and two others appeared, one standing on this bank of the stream, and the other on the other. One of them said to the man clothed in linen, who was upstream, 'How long shall it be until the end of these wonders?' The man clothed in linen, who was upstream, raised his right hand and his left towards heaven, and I heard him swear by the one who lives forever that it would be for a time, 2 times, half a time," etc., etc. So the actual, when is this going to happen? The end times it's not given. I mean, it's a time, a half time. It's kind of confusing language there. But you can see how this is apocalyptic and how closely these parts of Daniel relate to the book of Revelation that we have. John, is told to write these things down, to seal them. It's a secret. Don't tell everybody. This has secret meaning for people. And we're going to explore those kinds of themes as we go through this study week by week. Next week, we are going to read some material that's probably not familiar to most of you, and that's from the book called First Enoch. And First Enoch is a really fascinating piece of the Jewish pseudepigrapha, as I mentioned, and it appears in the Ethiopian Bible as part of the Old Testament. So there's a couple of sections from Genesis that will be very informative. There's no apocalypse in Genesis, but these sections of Genesis will inform First Enoch. And First Enoch, we're going to look at least, I think, the three sections on Apocalypse. So I would encourage you, before next week, if you get a chance, to read Genesis chapter 5, 11 through 27, and Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 8. And then Hannah will send out on the email next Tuesday either a link or the actual text of some parts of First Enoch. Thank you all. I know wrapping up, it was a little quicker today with technical issues. I'm glad I was able to find you from my phone, and hopefully we'll be back in the office next week. I hope you all are warm and safe, whether you're tuning in live or watching this on a video later on. If you have questions, please feel free to send them hfisher@stmichael.org. Hannah will collect those, and she can send those to me. And if you have any questions from today's talk, I can hopefully address those next week. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Have a great day. God bless you.